Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's finally time for the year-end list. So, 2022, sure has been a year, huh? How good this year was for electronic music, I suppose, is going to depend on who you ask. In one breath, I feel like the genre saw more mainstream attention this year than it has in a long time. 90s house revivalism, and to a lesser extent jungle breakbeat revivalism, properly became the cool new trends this year, with so many big artists taking a stab at some old retro electronic sounds and nearly all turning out at least some quality. There were even 3 big mainstream pop stars who released albums that were technically electronic enough to fall within my format, in The Weeknd's Dawn FM, Beyonce's Renaissance, and that crappy Drake thing that's not even worth dignifying, but was technically trying to be a house record, and it proves that house was trendy. I didn't cover any of those, since I tend not to have enough to say about the big mainstream pop stars that literally all other critics don't already cover. But I could've. I did think both The Weeknd and Beyonce things were quite solid. On the other hand, if you asked a fan of, 70s synth pioneers, they'd probably tell you this year was terrible, having lost the likes of Klaus Schulze, Vangelis, Manuel Gosching, Andy Fletcher from Depeche Mode, Maxi Jazz from Faithless. The latter's not a synth pioneer, but so many legends passing away in such close proximity to each other has been pretty rough. RIP to all of them once again. This truly has been a year of a lot of wild ups and downs, though then there's the question of my own listening habits. In terms of the albums that have resonated with me over the course of the year, 2022 is about on par with last year, I think, but also with completely different rationale. 2021 was a year where my list was completely dominated by underground artists, and I felt like I was getting pretty much nothing out of the big mainstream names. This year is also mostly underground-centric, but that wasn't for a lack of quality in the mainstream this time. If I'd expanded this list out to a top 20, then it's entirely possible a name like Odessa could have just barely made the cut. And I also gotta mention Röyksopp's Profound Mysteries trilogy, too. Even if I think all 3 albums were much too inconsistent to be in consideration for the list, if I counted, the custom album I made for myself out of just my favorite tracks from them, which looks like this, that'd be in the top 5 of the list. It'd be at number 4. No, mainstream electronic music did good this year. I just think the focus on underground artists in this list stems more from the fact that I developed a mild addiction to buying random albums on Bandcamp on impulse this year. Compared to the 50-odd releases I bought in 2021, I've made a total of 138 purchases in Bandcamp in 2022, not even including a couple of pre-orders from things that won't drop until early next year. And I've done over 100 segments in my Some Stuff I Missed roundups from throughout the year that couldn't even cover all of those. I am always happy to support and give more attention to smaller artists who could use it. It's one of my favorite things to do with this channel. That said, I will also have to admit that actually figuring out the sequencing for this list felt markedly more difficult this year than it even does most years. And that's because even though there have been tons of properly great electronic albums this year, there have been very few that started entering into, transcendental territory. I scored lots of projects in the lower 8 range, but only a couple in, the 8.5 range or higher. And not even all the ones I did score in that upper range stayed there later in the year. This is definitely one of those years where the numerical scores I gave to albums aren't necessarily going to reflect how high they make it up the list, and this is also definitely one of those years where I'm not really super confident in a lot of the exact placements I've made. The only placements I'm absolutely sure of are my number 3 and my number 4. Those 2 are in the exact place on the list that they make the most sense to be in for me. But aside from that, my top 2 were always the same 2 albums, but they rapidly switched places with each other over the course of the year. And pretty much everything from number 5 downwards, and even including several honorable mentions, have been shifting around a ton depending on my mood as well. So many picks I've included here are a super close call with each other. This list has been almost unusually difficult to pin down. But I did eventually decide on a ranking I was generally happy enough with, so here we are. Obligatory reminder that this is all just my opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with it. Feel free to share your own lists and recommendations in the comments if you feel so inclined. You know the drill by this point. But I think that'll be enough prelude. So let's get into it. This is the top 10 best albums of 2022. So before we get into the list proper, here's a handful of honorable mentions. Honorable mention number 1, music, Magic Pony Ride. Alright, we're starting off with one of the old standbys, though it has been a long time since Mike Paradinas made one of these lists. The guy is absolutely not reinventing the wheel here. It's a fairly standard collection of banging old-school breakbeats and bright melodies, nothing you haven't heard from him before, but this one has particularly stuck with me because of how much pathos is behind it. These melodies are both uplifting and melancholy and are a lot more emotionally resonant than I'm even typically used to out of him, and as I mentioned in my review, no other album has really gotten me to think about Mike Paradinas the person than this one. It feels like it just aimed to illustrate the place he currently is in his life. Perhaps not the same edgy game changer he once was, but now having started a family with his wife and 2 kids, and settled down a lot more, perhaps going out on lower-key vacations like the one that inspired this album in the first place. And sure, this album may run together quite a bit, but the melodies and the whole dreamlike vibe it all creates is more than enough to keep me invested in it. This has been sticking with me a lot more than I would have expected off my initial listens. It's just kept growing on me, and now I'd put it among some of his best work. Honorable mention number 2, Caitlin Aurelia Smith, Let's Turn It Into Sound. On the other side of the coin, here we have an album which may not have gotten the same kind of emotional resonance, but had to be included here thanks to how dang inventive and out of the box it is. One of the most impressively crazy listens of the year, like a cross between One-O-Tricks Point Never and Anna Meredith. None of the sounds that go into these tracks are off-putting in themselves. It's all very pretty and pleasant mixes of lots of different synth textures and drum machines, more traditional orchestral instrumentation like strings and horns, and of course Smith's own heavily processed vocals, alongside maybe a fuller chorus of backup vocalists. But it's the structuring of all these elements, or more accurately the lack thereof, that really makes this stuff stand out. All these tracks are so strange and abstract, rapidly switching from house to IDM to ambient to electroacoustic, abruptly shifting between all these different sounds on a dime and always keeping you guessing where they might go next in any given second, but still all really fitting together and adding up to a fully cohesive experience that may as well could be treated as one single track if you like. It may not exactly be the kind of listen that I'm in the mood for all the time, and may not be the kind of thing that will hit you immediately. Smith even advertised it as a bit of a puzzle, but there's really been nothing quite like it this year, and it has pretty effortlessly floored me every time I have put it on. Honorable mention number 3, Daniel Bachman, Almanac Behind. Right, now, this was one of the most novel and interesting ideas for an album I'd heard in quite a while. Daniel Bachman may not really be an artist known for making electronic music that I know of, perhaps better known for being more of like an instrumental folk artist who delivers lots of solo slide guitar and banjo material. But man, this album was so interesting in the way it incorporated those instrumental folk elements into this way more experimental project that included a whole bunch of field recordings and found audio from radio broadcasts and telephone messages and perhaps more glitching and processing of his guitars and banjos. All adding up to a concept album about how climate change has completely shifted the way we experience weather. A listening experience that aims to take you out into some rural area in the middle of nowhere going through some big natural disaster, be it a flood, a tornado, or a wildfire. In between the banjo pieces you hear experimental noise, emergency weather broadcasts, phone messages from people who just lost power, all conveying this very musically neutral feeling, as if to say this is just the new normal for the planet we live on now. It's truly unlike any other album I've ever heard in my life. Completely immersive, feeling extremely true to life, especially if you've experienced any disaster like what it portrays yourself, and you live in the US. And fully captivating to listen to from start to finish. The one thing preventing this project from making the list proper is the fact that I feel like this album really only works if I give it my full attention with no other distractions. It can occasionally feel a bit too musically sparse where the concept is taking precedence over all else, and with something this experimental, it's obviously not going to be for everyone. I'd get it if some people didn't think this was musical enough to work for them, but man, with an idea this unique and this well executed, I gotta give it a high recommendation anyway. Definitely check it out. Honorable mention number 4, Patricia Taxon, Wax Under Wolkenum. Okay, I don't think this artist being here is going to be a surprise. She has shown up on my year-end lists fairly regularly, topped my list in 2020, and she's only been becoming higher and higher profile, culminating in earlier this year when she got a direct cosign from Sean Booth of Oudiker, which is beyond surreal, but absolutely deserved. Though if you've been paying attention to my reviews, it might come as more of a surprise that I decided to highlight this album she put out back in January and not another album she came out with later in the year that I gave an even higher score, Visiting Narcissa. Now that album is also still great, and it certainly sounds like it'd be even more up my alley, focusing a lot more on these all these long-winded abstract IDM excursions over a very meaty 87 minutes. Though as much as that album blew me away in the moment, and as much as I expected that album to more or less make this one redundant, it's also kinda shrunk on me. I felt a bit emotionally distant from it, found a bit too many parts of it to meander a little bit. It was much more recent Oudiker-like, for better and worse. Now, I have probably listened to that album more than this one this year, but near the end of the year, I started to come back to this one a bit, and ended up thinking, you know what, actually I think I like this one a little more. Like, this album is also kind of a half IDM album, with all the odd number tracks being similarly open-ended seas of glitchy abstraction. But the even number tracks here are more experimental hip-hop and vocal pop-leaning stuff. And it's the balance between these two sides that I feel was really key for this album. The fact that it did both of these styles and paced them out in such a way where each one provide the perfect palate cleanser from the cut that came before. It's that way better pacing in the sense that every track adds something of substance without any filler that's got it to stick that little bit better with me. Also, the track with CJ the X grew on me a lot thanks to it getting stuck in my head without warning at a whole bunch of random intervals throughout the year. And the 16-minute closer Cage still floors me, and I love that whole section that references Kraftwerk's Morgan Spazier Gong. Doesn't appear to have been everyone's cup of tea, but it was mine this year. Definitely worth coming back to if you missed it. Honorable mention number 5, Charlotte Adigéry and Bolis Pupul, Topical Dancer. Go back to your country where you belong. Okay, now this is the entry on this list that I scored the lowest when it first came out, originally only giving it a 7.7 out of 10. It may not have been the most musically or sonically striking project I've included here. I initially found it to be a slight bit of a mixed bag and made me feel like I was going way out of my depth trying to talk about it at all. But man, has this one just been living rent-free in my head throughout the year and been getting better and better every time I put it on. With even all the tracks I was initially iffy on growing on me, and now I don't think there's a single weak track in the bunch. Just tons of fantastically minimal but super tight dance grooves that easily stick in my head, with all these lyrics that go off on various social issues, from racism to beauty standards to social media discourse, with an especially sarcastic and witty tone that can make some particularly serious subject matter that could end up feeling really uncomfortable if handled incorrectly, end up really consistently funny and cathartic. Much more of a feel-good listen than you'd think, with so many genius ideas and lines like that freaking Columbus line on the closing track that gets me every single time. Some cuts can hit a bit different for me now, with Twitter in the process of self-destructing, but still, if Fantano's recommendation wasn't enough to make you check this out, I can co-sign this every little bit as much as he did. This was great. Honorable mention number 6, Batu, Opal. Right, now here's one that I haven't really seen anyone else talking about, but definitely deserves a mention. This experimental bass music and techno artist from the UK may include a lot of elements from various different styles I already like, but presents them in such a way that isn't like anyone else out there. A lot of thunderous and visceral percussive moments going up against a lot of chilling melodic textures that can at once feel quite cold and foreboding, but also oddly organic, clearly being inspired by like geological forces of nature and rocks and minerals and the strange natural phenomena within that can be both beautiful but also go beyond human comprehension. He even feels cinematic to some degree and does a great job of setting this particular kind of tense mood that totally envelops me and keeps me on the edge of my seat the whole way through, and flows remarkably well, outside of maybe the one cut with Serpent with Feet, which might be a tiny bit out of place, but is still very nice. I still don't know how to properly describe the experience of listening to this, and I don't know if my descriptions can fully do it justice, but I can absolutely recommend going out of your way to hear it. Honorable mention number 7, Carl Cox, Electronic Generations. Another Another classic reminder of why I wait until the very end of the year to do these lists. If one is to put out their list in November, they might end up missing stuff like this. This album may not be as difficult to describe as the Batu album is. It sticks to a lot more straightforward, tried and true techno formulas. But man, there's been no other albums this year that went so dang viscerally hard in the way this project did. The album with the tightest and most easily danceable grooves I'd heard in 2022, coming from one of the pioneering legends of UK techno who got his start in the late 80s and early 90s, and isn't typically known for his original albums, more for his DJ work, but completely knocked it out of the park with all these banging techno and electro grooves that take sounds and approaches as throwbacks to the early 90s in terms of the textures of drum machines he uses and all the minimalistic acid progressions, but also coming at these retro sounds from a more modern EDM influenced lens, which means the production is a lot more clean and polished, and that makes every single kick, snare, and hi-hat feel like they were mathematically calculated to deliver the most visceral possible impact on your body. The album may be quite long and not have a ton of variety, but every track just slaps so hard that it keeps me more than invested on its own despite the length. Again, just some great freaking dance music here, not much else to say. Honorable mention number 8, The Future Sound of London, Rituals E7.001. And one last shout out for a more obvious standby. This project may not be among my absolute favorite work FSOL have ever done, and it doesn't deliver anything they haven't proven themselves to be capable of before. It very much sticks to their core sound and biggest strengths, but it still does them in such a cool way as always. I was slightly underwhelmed by the album on first listen, thought it just sounded like the exact average of their entire catalog, but it's just kept growing and growing on me throughout the year since these guys have just always had that effortless knack for these psychedelic listening experiences that take you on such wild and vibrant journeys through liquid blends of ambient techno and experimentalism that always feels easily accessible in spite of how weird and alien it can get. It is only the first volume in a trilogy, which only has one other sequel out as of recording this. A Space of Partial Illumination is also quite nice, if much more scattershot and not flowing quite as well, but this album is more than able to stand on its own as just really freaking nice of strange but lush ambient subspaces and sonic environments, and even if this wasn't an immediate hitter, as always, it's exceptionally hard to go wrong with The Future Sound of London. And I'm going to stop there for the honorable mentions, but this year has also been particularly strong when it comes to, individual tracks that I've enjoyed listening to out of context, so I'm going to continue what I started last year and go through a whole bunch of my favorite tracks as well. Unless I mention otherwise, these are also full endorsements of the albums they come from, which I think are also worth checking out. They're all very solid to varying extents, and a lot of them were also potential honorable mentions from throughout the year. So let's go through those real quick. Or as quick as reasonably possible, since I have 25 picks for you, going alphabetically by artist. And yeah, that list was actually extremely difficult to cut down to that few. There's so much great stuff out there that I could keep going and add like 10 more, but I didn't want to keep you too long, so I'm gonna stop there. Anyway, let's finally get into the list proper. Number 10. Björk, Fossora.
I thank her for her integrity.
Alright, let's start the list with the least underground pick and the one most people are most likely to already know about. Because of course, Björk of all people would be the closest to a mainstream pick I have. Okay, but seriously though, I was really surprised by the amount of negativity I saw around this one. It felt like me and Spectrum Pulse were the only critics on this platform to really get into this album with way more middling reviews from other people than I ever would have expected. From fans as well. I saw a whole bunch of people complaining about the fact that Björk doesn't make catchy pop tunes anymore, and I was like, are you freaking for real? If you're really complaining about that in 2022, I have to assume you've never been all that big a fan of Björk to begin with. Pop-friendly accessibility hasn't been part of her appeal since the mid-90s, if I'm being generous. Okay, but there are more legitimate criticisms people have leveled at this project. For one thing, it's not exactly a brand of weirdness that she hasn't already explored before. It's basically a combination of ideas she's done on previous albums like Biophilia, or Volta, or Utopia. All projects that have proven to be quite divisive in the past. But first of all, I'm not about to complain about that since I quite like all of those projects. I really like this album's lusher instrumental palette of various clarinets and other woodwinds crashing into all the various Gabber-influenced beatwork, and I think it's her most instrumentally diverse project in ages. I also really like how it's coming from a much more grounded and healthier mental space than either of her previous two projects. And all the lyrics touching on themes of motherhood by way of fungal metaphors, both talking about her relationship with her own children and giving tributes to her own mother who'd recently passed away, especially seen on the track Ancestress, which is one of the best tracks she's ever done, period. Such an emotionally crushing and beautiful moment. I can definitely understand the people to whom this didn't click, and obviously Björk is never going to be for everyone on a baseline level, but for me, this is her strongest project in over a decade, and it's continued to stick with me. Number 9. 99 Letters, Kaibo Zukan. Now, this is the most recent entrant into the list proper. This is a Japanese experimental artist who makes his music out of processing traditional Japanese instrumentation like koto and shakuhachi. And even if it sounds especially spooky and fairly off-putting on the surface, as well as being very stripped back and maybe even a little on the repetitive side, it's a lot more accessible than you might think. There are a lot of nice, really lo-fi ambient atmospheres and techno grooves. Every track is quite striking in its own right despite how little there is to any given cut. And the whole thing creates a surprisingly alluring kind of liminal space effect, like the soundtrack to watching found footage of communicating with spirits. Not friendly spirits, but not malicious ones either. They are just ambivalent towards the living. It's the kind of thing I've even liked coming back to a decent bit in the last month, hitting on a similar appeal for me that certain old vaporwave projects could, even if there's obviously a very different and more unique approach to the sounds behind this. It's surprisingly replayable stuff. It was really close between this and the Daniel Bachman project for this spot, though this required much less of a specific mood and environment for me to get into, and felt more actually musical. Even if not an anytime listen, it just kept me wanting to come back to it. So there you go, this was some really cool stuff. Make sure to check it out. Number 8. Kelly Lee Owens, LP8. There's something kind of innately satisfying about having my number 9 pick from an artist called 99 Letters and my number 8 pick being an album called LP8. I like that. But anyway, on the topic of satisfying, this last Kelly Lee Owens project stuck with me in a way her previous work really hadn't before. In the past, I might have found her style to be a bit too minimalistic and plain, but for this album, she decided to go in a bit more experimental and abstract direction, creating an experience that is quite meditative, in the most literal possible way. The whole album is directly trying to be about meditation, with tracks focused on the idea of breathing or spiritual cleansing and that kind of thing, with a really unique sonic blend that was aiming to thread the needle between artists as vastly different as Throbbing Gristle and Enya. And it's really damn effective at what it's going for. A lot of the sounds themselves are ones she's already explored to some extent, and it does stick to a style that's still very easily recognizable as Kelly Lee Owens, both in terms of the airy synths, the thick and bassy percussion, and her own breathy and ethereal vocals. But the recontextualization of her usual sounds into this much more abstract context paradoxically made it easier for me to connect with than her previous work. Heck, it even got me to better appreciate her older stuff more for what it was. As with the Björk album, it doesn't appear to have been everyone's cup of tea. When I reviewed it alongside Ryan from Not Real Music, he appeared to be a lot cooler on it than I was and found the experience to run together too much, which I do absolutely get. But for me, that actually worked to this album's benefit, as it feels like all these various tracks were enhancing and building off each other, and working together to create one single unified experience, much more so than her previous two projects did. I may not have been completely sold on Kelly Lee Owens before, but she grew on me a lot after this project dropped, and I'm definitely looking forward to hearing where she ends up taking her sound in the future. Number 7. Tipper, Marble Hunting. Next up, we got, well, someone who hasn't made something I've liked enough to put on a list like this since 2010, but who I imagine might be more of one of the usual suspects for some other people who watch these videos. As per usual, Tipper is absolutely killing it with his high-detail sound design. It's pretty much his thing, it's what everyone comes to him for, it's why his fanbase is so ridiculously dedicated. Though great sound design alone is not always enough to carry an album for me, he's had projects that, as impressively produced as they were, could run together and not leave as much of an impact on me as they seem to for most fans. But Marble Hunting was a bit of an interesting shift for him. Compared to the more laid-back, down-tempo focus of his last two efforts, this is a full album of his more up-tempo experimental dubstep material, which he usually saves for his EPs. And it ended up as one of the craziest and most vibrant half hours of music I've heard this year. Every track just has some cool element or texture to pull you in, wiry melodies, blubbering percussion, nasty and gritty bass drops, aggressive acid synths, punchy instrumental hip-hop sampling, mason jar percussion. You never know what you're going to get on any given track, and it all goes really damn hard. And in spite of how short the album is, it does feel like you're getting a full-length experience out of it that knows just when to get in and get out before anything ever becomes tiring. As many mixed thoughts as I've had on Tipper's back catalog over the years, when he hits, there is nothing else that can even compare to it, and I think this is going to go down for me as among some of his best work. Number 6. Tourist, Inside Out. Sometimes, though, you don't really need to have big, flashy technical achievements or crazy out-of-the-box sound design to win me over. Sometimes you run into an album whose appeal is so simple and straightforward, but hits you on a deep emotional note anyway. And that brings us to Tourist. I was not especially going into this expecting it to strike such a visceral note for me when I first saw it from a recommendation from Ryan from Not Real Music. It certainly doesn't do anything all that crazy or out of the box in its mixes of breezy house beats and airy vocal chops, but man, it really did. Just lots of very breezy and blissful mixes of house and garage with a very uplifting but also melancholy tone to everything. The kind of music that really just conveys wide open blue skies and bright sunlight and summery weather, but also feels like it has the subtext of some kind of greater loss in the background. It really hit such a strong emotional note for me that very few albums this year could. I will say it is a tiny bit front-loaded, with the first 3 tracks carrying the vast majority of the weight for me. That run of the tone setter Speakin' Symphony and the catchy spaciness of Your Love into probably the single biggest standout in Avalanche. Really unmatched in all of house music this year. But every track here delivers its own little new twist on the same mix of styles with solid memorable hooks, and even if a couple like Lark can occasionally lean a bit towards the more commercial Kygo tropical house side, it still does that sound really well too and gets the pathos behind it to connect. I kinda don't really know what else to say about it, even if I discovered it fairly late in the year and it might not have gotten the same amount of repeat visits as the projects ranked above it. This filled a similar niche for me that maybe Wayward did last year. doing some simple by-the-books formulas fantastically well. But it would also be nice to get an album that could both deliver on this kind of deeper emotional level while delivering a lot of creative instrumental ideas at the same time. Say, for example, number 5, Sig New Grease, Threshold. Next up, we get the most impressive debut effort I've heard this year. Sig New Grease, aka Aaron Hyde, is a producer from Australia whom I'd never heard of before this album got highlighted in a Bandcamp Daily feature, but man, it was really something else. Delivering such a wide variety between bubbly and uplifting drum and bass, thunderous and abrasive club bangers, and experimental ambient synth doodles, all adding up to a surprisingly cohesive emotional arc where it seems like we start in very pleasant territory, but get darker and darker and continually descend into complete madness. Even getting borderline frightening in a few parts in the most enjoyable way, and perhaps ending on a bit of a bleak note, but still. Now, this may not hit quite the same emotional note as the Tourist album, even though it's a very different kind of emotion, which is a lot more tense and unnerving on average. And it's not quite as well engineered or well detailed as the Tipper album. While the mastering is more than serviceable for what it's going for and still getting all the atmosphere and groove to perfectly carry across, I did feel like it was oddly mastered to be a bit quieter than some of these other albums, and there was also a part of me who wanted to see the individual ideas on display developed a bit more and have more detail. Stuff like this made this album particularly difficult for me to figure out where exactly it might fall in the list. It's more of a jack-of-all-trades kind of album and has probably taken up every lower numerical spot in this video at various spots throughout December. But I was always completely sure it was on the list proper and never an honorable mention. And none of my issues ever rose beyond being mostly minor nitpicks. All the ideas behind each track, as simple as they may be on their own, are still so creative and striking and widely versatile. And again, it's especially the way they are juxtaposed and play off each other in such an effective way to become inseparable in the full album context that really makes it work so well. There's no way for me to be able to sum up the experience of hearing this thing just by playing one or two tracks. And as someone who's always been a firm believer in the idea that music does not need words to convey deeper meaning or even tell a story, this album is a shining example of that. And again, this is only your debut album. With some further refinement and possibly some extra budget if that ever happens, you could have the potential to deliver something on a whole different transcendental level. But even on its own, Threshold is one of the most forward-thinking, creative, and exciting listening experiences I've had in 2022, has repeatedly brought me back over the latter section of the year, and it's absolutely worth hearing if it's passed you by. Number 4. Passerani, the Wildlife of the Quieter Ones. Ah yes, the odd case of Marco Passerani. This is not an album that showcases a lot of flashy sound design. It doesn't deliver any particularly big emotional hitters. It sounds like an extremely standard and plain blend of old school deep house and 90s artificial intelligence style ambient techno. A blend which I've mentioned having fallen out of love with due to hearing too many projects which played this exact sound completely straight, either from the 90s or up through modern day. It's also very long, 17 tracks stretching well over an hour, and when I covered it I even mentioned thinking 2 cuts out should not have been included for the sake of tightening things up. And yet I also mentioned in the intro of this video that I was absolutely confident of my number 4 pick. Above all these other seemingly much more striking new releases, this album has not budged from this exact spot in the list since like a month after I covered it. I have just kept wanting to come back to it over and over, and I don't even stand by my previous critique of wanting to skip those 2 tracks. They don't weigh down the experience anymore. See, as it turns out, this album has proven itself to be more of an example of why these old formulas are returned to so often. For as basic as it seems on the surface, it just keeps delivering addicting groove after addicting groove, lots of solid memorable hooks, and the album never runs together either despite its length. I can always tell exactly where I am in the album through every time I put it on and can fairly easily recall what most of these tracks sound like. And sure, some tracks hit more than others, like the bright intro track, the subtle earworms of Theme from FFOM or Dial 101 or Strawberry Strings, thicker bass stabs of Rays of Thunder, heartfelt and dramatic downtempo interludes like Requiem 1 and The Sixth Day, And of course the big centerpiece, Equation, continues to give me the same level of excitement as Green Album era Orbital. And again, I do not make Orbital comparisons lightly. Maybe not everyone will find it as near endlessly replayable as I have, but it's right up there as among my single most played albums over the course of the whole year. 2022 was a year that proved that all the retro 90s dance cliches were alive and well, and Passerani had tons of possible competition. Even just the other day, CFAX Acid Crew decided to crash in at the last minute with a whole deep house album on Christmas that hit a lot of the same notes as this thing and was also very good. But even he wasn't going to beat this, which has very much turned out to be the low-stakes sleeper hit for me this year, like Box Steady was last year. Well, that and this next one, which wasn't quite as much of a grower as Passerani, but instead showed its greatness to me a lot more immediately. Number 3. Spunkshine, a memory of something vast and elemental. Man, this album just makes me happy on so many different levels. Now, in one breath, it's very standard fare for what Spunkshine has regularly delivered nearly every consecutive year since the mid-2000s. Still the same mixes of bright quirkiness and weird instrumental flourishes, going up next to surprisingly heartfelt low-key ambient moments, with all the usual recognizably simple chord progressions, delivering material that is always plenty strange and off-the-wall but also very easy to connect with, never off-putting or attempting to ditch accessible melodies or grooves. But having been listening to Spunkshine's material semi-regularly for years now, I was also going into this album expecting it to be a bit of a mixed bag. It's very common for his albums to run on too long, maybe have a couple of cuts that weren't that interesting, even on my previous favorite albums of his. And yet despite sticking to all the sounds I know him for, he just happened to not deliver a single miss on this one. Every single track on here is wholly entertaining, and they're even well sequenced to never cut into each other or end up with weird, awkward tone jumps. Even on an album that can both have a track called The Smell of Gravity, featuring tubas as the lead bass line on a banging up-tempo funk number, but also have a track called Death by Planet, which feels way more desolate and muted with lots of lonely ambient synth pads. These two extremes can be bridged by tracks like Made Away themselves, which can have their sillier textures all over the place, but seem to be most concerned with marveling at the vast scale of the universe as we know it. And all of it works together so well in a way that I was just not prepared for. As I said in my review, the whole album is like listening to a lecture from a really enthusiastic science teacher who just genuinely thinks science is so damn cool and is dedicated to passing that enthusiasm down to his students, showing off how wild and wacky the world we live in is, but also how massive and overwhelming it can be as well. It's an album that I don't think is physically possible for anyone to make it through without cracking a smile, either at the silliness or the genuine heartwarmingness. And to make another parallel with CFAX Acid Crew's Box Steady, out to be avoided only by those who dislike fun. Guy freaking outdid himself like never before. I think it's his best album to date, and absolutely essential listening. Alright, and now we finally made it to the top 2, which, before I get into those, I feel like I need to mention that this is the single closest pick for a top 2 that I have ever had. Sounds from the Ground and Coma Duster weren't even this close in 2017 as these two albums were. They're functionally a tie, an exact tie, and deliver on such completely different vibes to make them near impossible to properly compare to each other. Both had me absolutely sure they'd be my favorite album of the year when I reviewed them, but when I was in the mood for one on a particular day, I wouldn't really be as much into the other, and vice versa, and it would rapidly switch back and forth depending on my mood, especially near the end of the year. Both were on such a whole different level of enjoyment that nothing else in 2022 even came particularly close to, but again, I didn't want to just cop out and make them an actual tie, so here's the ordering I finally decided on. Number 2. Rum Pistol, Isola. Isola is not really the kind of album that I've ever really felt like writing about. It's just an album that I feel kinda speaks for itself. delivering such a raw emotional punch that very few albums in any genre are able to deliver for me on a general level. If you've been following my year-end lists before, you might remember this guy making my list in 2020 with his After the Flood album, an album which showed him moving away from his previously established style of belabored IDM and glitchy electroacoustic work into a much more stripped-back, piano-centric modern classical style. That was an album that also hit on a lot of really strong emotional notes and kept me coming back repeatedly over not just that year, but the following one as well. Until this year, when he followed up that album with another one that topped it in every conceivable way, expanding out the instrumental palette to also include elements of jazz and dub alongside the mild strains of synths and heavily emotional classical piano arrangements. Isola is the kind of album that seems to have a track and an idea for every season and every time of year, with plenty of variety, dark moments, light moments, cold moments, warm moments, but all perfectly adding up to this cohesive arc which seems to follow the grieving process after losing a close loved one. And there are several different moments which leave me tearing up pretty much every time. Especially the vocal version of New Beginning, which the album closes with, only on the Bandcamp version. That needs to be the version you hear, by the way. I'm just kind of at a loss for words with Isola. During all the lowest points of the year, this album was there for me, and providing all the most perfect notes of warm empathy and comfort that I could ever want. And even during the times of the year when I wasn't in as much need for this particular kind of comfort food music, its wide variety and instrumentation still always worked for me and lit up the part of my brain that grew up with artists like Andreas Vollenweider. Even if your taste happens to not mirror my own or you prefer totally different genres from me, Isola is an absolute must-listen for anyone. And again, for half of the year, I was absolutely positive it would easily take the #1 spot on this list. That said, this channel has always been about electronic music, and while there are synths on this album, they're relatively few and far between, and they're never really the main focus of any given track. So that left me wanting to lean a bit more towards this last pick, which might not have been quite as much of an emotional heavy hitter as Isola, not like most things are, but I had been equally confident it'd take the top spot in the other half of the year, for its own reasons. So let's get into that. Number 1. Vale Smith, Chorus Gate. I didn't give this album a 9 out of 10 score when I reviewed it, but the only reason I didn't is honestly just because I was so completely blindsided by it. I just did not see it coming at all. It literally came out on January 1st. I had just finished my year-end list for 2021. I figured it was generally going to be fun, but could not have possibly prepared myself for the level he ended up hitting on. And in the moment, I was thinking, there's no way. There's no way that the first new album I hear in the new year is already on a comparable level of enjoyment to that Ski Mask album. And it came from one of my reviewing colleagues. That's nuts. I must be going nuts. I gotta calm down. But it just freaking stuck with me. I just kept listening to it over and over and over and continually getting the same ridiculous level of joy and excitement out of it every time. Vale Smith coming through with a blend of UK garage, IDM, wonky, future bass, trap, house, and more, covering everything in all these instantly likable bright melodies, frantic banging beats, and glitchy samples. Every single second of this album has something new to notice and get me excited, yet still has tons of pathos behind it. Rum Pistol may have been there for me in all the lowest moments of 2022, but Vale Smith was there for me in all the highest points. When I was in a good mood and I would put this on, it would always instantly amplify my good mood by several leaps and bounds. I would frequently put this on when I drove home from work, and like on some days when daylight savings hadn't kicked in, it was pitch black outside, and just the experience of listening to this through the car sound system and driving through the night, it just delivered such an unbelievable thrill. From the initial burst of pure joy that Ceramic Skies and Know Me delivered, to the epic bass drops of Ace Ransom, and especially Veracity in the Warehouse, best drop of the entire year at the end of that one. Also, the more heartfelt melodic breathers provided by cuts like A Passage, Revealing Light, or Think Lavender, or the fluffy pillow of glassy synths that is tethered to us, or the late period wake-up call of Setting Sun, and the perfect emotional finale of Hummingbird. All 15 tracks in this album perfectly link into each other and deliver so many cool textures to pay attention to. And sure, maybe some of the cuts like Give Your Best or Looper can fall into the background occasionally, but even they're pretty instantly recognizable as individuals too. I have admittedly seen my other reviewing colleagues hear Coruscate and not get the same transcendental experience I got out of it. Some people have told me they found more enjoyment in the second album he put out this year, Rekindle. Yes, he has already followed this thing up. Which I also think is very good, albeit much more stripped back and not quite the non-stop roller coaster this album provided for me. You should check that out too, or his other two albums he released in 2019 and 2020 in case those end up doing more for you as well. But really, the main reason why Will Smith felt the most fitting to me for the top spot over Rumpistol isn't just because he's more electronic, or because his album was the light to mirror Rumpistol's darkness, but really just because he's the far smaller and less well-known artist. Rumpistol may also not exactly be a household name and pretty heavily overlooked, but he's still got a decently well-established fanbase from having worked since the 2000s and has about the size of audience I would expect out of the particular niche he fills. Will Smith, on the other hand, doesn't really see any attention outside of this particular circle of internet reviewers, and he deserves so freaking much more. This album made me want to see Will Smith go viral. He deserves at least as big an audience as Rumpistol, if not standing alongside Will Smith's actual inspirations like Igloo Ghost and Rusty and Hudson Mohawk and all those. If you take anything away from this video, it's that you should please give this man more attention. He absolutely freaking deserves better. And even if only by a hair, he made my personal favorite album of 2022. And there you have it. That's the list. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next year.